presentation. Next week's presentation is Luis Pacheco and Steve Balfour, who are in the title is the LCS AGM and Future Planning. The annual general meeting of LCS is going to come up on March the
14th. My birthday. Oh, yeah.
the AGM. When is it?
March 14th.
March 14th.
It's my birthday also.
At the birthday of Diana.
Celebrate.
She likes flowers, roses, tulips, chocolates. So on March 14th is going to be an annual general meeting. And next Sunday will be your opportunity to voice your opinion, offer suggestions about LCS and its mission. So Steve is in his last year as president. Steve Balfour is in his last year as president here. Unless there's a coup, of course. And Luis celebrates his second year anniversary since he started as the executive director. And they will be talking about progress made since the last AGM and the challenges we still face. Now, at last year's AGM, Steve charged the board of directors with 5 priority goals: customer service, technology, community collaborations, visibility, taking care of what we have. So if you have any opinions, come next week and voice them. So, and now we have this week. Right. Now, today's Sandy Britton, letting Mexico mellow you out. Now today Sandy will be telling us about the inevitable culture clashes we have all faced here in Mexico and how the concept of cultural intelligence helped her understand her adopted country better, but even more important, how her time in Mexico has altered her view of life. Now Sandy Britton is from Northern California. Her background is in software development. Wait a minute, I know this person. Software development and dog training. But she combines her love of cultural sociology and public speaking to bring you this presentation. Please give a warm, open circle welcome to Sandy Britton.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Buenos dias. So this is an updated version of a talk I gave many years ago. Some of you may have even been here for that one. I came across it again and thought it was worth presenting again. And I was surprised when I went over it that a lot of the stuff in it... Am I cutting it out?
Yes.
Okay, we good? But a lot of the stuff in it was still true. So somebody's saying more... I feel like I'm cutting it out. Is that it? I keep turning my head because I feel like I'm cutting out. Okay, so this time I went over it with no. Okay, is that better? Hopefully I can remember to keep it, if I start going like this, you know, give me a signal. Okay, so this time I went over this talk with a Mexican friend. She's actually my Spanish tutor, because although I speak Spanish, I'm still cutting out. Although I speak Spanish, you can always get better, right? So she's a 27-year-old who lives in Guadalajara, so I thought she's in a completely different, demographic than I am. I thought that would give us a broader perspective. So I want to start out with an anecdote, a memory from grade school, about 4th or 5th grade I think it was, and we were watching a film. I can't remember what the film was about. It was some educational film, and it portrayed like a Moroccan family all seated on the floor around the table and dipping their bread in the common pot and eating with their fingers. And a little boy in the family pulls a package out of his pocket, and it turns out to be a fork and spoon that he unrolls from a napkin, and his mom says, "What's that?" And he goes, "Oh, I thought I'd try eating with these." And she's saying, "You can't use those. You don't know where they've been. You know your hands are clean." So just the opposite of what I was used to, right? And I just remember this little ping going off in my brain at this concept that yes, I knew that cultures were different, but that the idea that for them, what they did made perfect sense. You know, to me, it looked wrong and weird, but to them, it made perfect sense within that culture. So that was my first exposure to the idea of cultural intelligence, the idea of understanding other cultures and why they are the way they are. And I've had a lifelong fascination with cultural differences. And the most important things I've learned, probably the most important thing, is that the most dramatic differences aren't really visible. They're at the unconscious level. So if you can imagine kind of an iceberg, you've got the part that's floating above the water that's obvious. That's the difference in language, food, clothing, traditions. We all can see that quite readily. But underneath that, there's a whole other unconscious layer of how people view the world. You know, the way, I'm going to read it here, the almost unconscious assumptions we make about how things are and how life should be lived that we absorb from our culture without even realizing it from the time we're born. And that's the part that really gives us trouble. That's the part that really can cause clashes because we don't even realize we're entering a situation with this preconception. And the other people are entering it with theirs, and they clash with each other. So on moving to Mexico, one of my goals was to really immerse myself in a different culture. And so I did a lot of things to make that happen. I learned the language. I live in the village in a pretty Mexican street. Got adopted by a neighbor family and attend all their important events. So I've gotten a lot of exposure to the culture. But I still realized there was some underlying values that I wasn't really getting. And so I consulted many resources, as some of you probably have, reading about Mexican culture. But the most enlightening one I came across was an audio course. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Great Courses audio series, or actually it's a video series, but this was audio. And it was called Customs of the World, Using Cultural Intelligence to Adapt Wherever You Are, by Professor David Livermore. Definitely the best course I've listened to on the Great Courses. So the idea behind cultural intelligence is understanding how another culture's underlying values, not just the visible stuff, are different from yours. Because we all feel our own cultural values are natural or right until we encounter different ones. Okay, so, and our natural reaction is, those people are wrong, not just different, they're doing it wrong, okay? But I think we've all kind of encountered by this time that if you want to adapt the other culture or at least get along in it, you have no choice but to accept the differences. You're not going to change the culture. And if you continue to just kind of butt your head against it, you're only going to get frustrated. So you really have to learn how to adapt to it to get along best. So the course addresses cultural differences all over the world. And while I listened to it, I had a lot of aha moments. I felt my attitude shifting, and sometimes it led me to reinterpret my past experiences here. And I learned more about my assumptions about my own culture, too. Okay, the course divides the world into 10 very broad cultural clusters. For instance, there's a cluster called Anglo, which is roughly all English-speaking countries. So Australia, Canada, England, United States. I know that those are really different, but this one only divides it into 10, so they're pretty broad. And my familiarity, of course, is with the USA. I'm American. But a cultural cluster could be something much more precise or finite than that. It could be a single country, a region within the country, a subculture in the country, like an ethnic subculture, or you even think about hippies or survivalists, these subcultures that exist within a culture. Religion, family, an organization, a generation. Things change quickly across generations, especially these days. Urban versus rural, a political party. So we can recognize that there's a lot of reasons you may have a different culture even than your next door neighbor. So this is painting with very broad strokes. Okay, the course rates each cultural cluster on a scale of what it calls value dimensions. So that's a framework of values held by a culture. So a culture can be described in broad strokes again by its rating on each of these categories. And we're describing them, we're not judging them. These are ethically and morally neutral. We're not talking about moral codes. So for instance, one of the value dimensions is individualism versus collectivism. And we can see that at either end of those scale, you could do things that are very good, and you could do things that are very bad or counterproductive. So it's not a matter of the moral or the goodness of it, it's just looking at the differences. And one thing I want to address is the idea behind stereotyping. I want to make it clear that when I talk about an Anglo or Mexican cultural value, I'm not saying that everybody in that culture shares that value. Every individual is different. There's a lot of reasons you could have different values from the prevailing culture. I'm just talking about in general. And once again, this is Anglo, and the other one is Latin America. So it includes a lot of other countries besides Mexico. I can only address what I've experienced here in Mexico. Okay, and a disclaimer. I'm not putting myself out there as any kind of expert. I'm sharing with you what this course said. So he's a social anthropology professor, and relating it to my own experiences, and I hope you can relate it to your experiences. So at the end, when it's question time, if you want to share some different experiences, that would be great too. All right, so to dive into these value dimensions. The first one is individualist versus collectivist. So there's a scale, a range from cultures that are extremely individualist to extremely collectivist. Where individualist cultures value self-reliance and independence, you're responsible first to yourself, to thine own self be true, and self-actualization is the pinnacle of mental health. Then there's collectivist cultures which value group reliance and interdependence. They're responsible first to the group, and social harmony is the pinnacle of mental health. Some of the questions that might be answered very differently by these different cultures are, who should make decisions about a person's life choices? In individualist culture, the person makes the decision. In a collectivist culture, the community or the family might make the decision. Who does it reflect on if the person does well or behaves poorly? And how much responsibility do members of a group have for each other? Those are some of the differences that on that scale. So the course says that Anglo cultures are highly individualist. I don't think anybody would be surprised to hear that. With one of the extremes being the USA. USA is extremely individualist. Whereas Latin America is highly collective, but it's concentrated in the extended family more than the general community. So I think we all know that I would say it's a key characteristic of Mexican culture that they're family-oriented. One of the most important things about the culture. All you have to do is go down to the Mellow on a Saturday night, and you're going to see people in big family groups, right? You're going to a restaurant, you're going to see people in big family groups. If you've gone to parties here, you know that you never say plus one. It's plus your family. At least the immediate family is going to attend. Okay, so and they may bring along the relatives that are visiting. Families here are extremely extended, and walking around with Mexican friends, and they're saying "Hola tia," "Hola tío," "Hola primo" to everybody because there's so many relationships. For instance, here, our first cousin is called primo hermano, my brother cousin. And the parents of your primo hermano are aunt and uncle. They aren't like second cousin, so the relationships feel much closer here. This affects child rearing practices and the age at leaving home. So kids are brought up to think about the family, to feel responsible to the family, but the family also cares for them. They tend to leave home much later, although I think in the United States that's definitely changing with the millennial and Gen Z, but so maybe we're coming closer on that. It affects how many people here live alone. One of the resources I checked said that 28% of people in the USA live in a single person household. I only know a few people here who do. It's very unusual here. Who cares for us in a hospital or when we get old? It's expected here that a relative is going to hang around. Nursing is set up with the idea that somebody's going to be there helping you out. The whole assisted living and everything that's popping up here is mostly for expats because there's really not a culture here of doing that. And another big thing is how many homeless. You know, in the United States, Sacramento has a terrible homeless problem right now. That's where I'm from. And every time I go back there, it jars me again because it's so unusual here. Because somebody will take you in. So talking to my tutor, Abby, about this, and she's basically saying she couldn't imagine a situation, no matter how bad of trouble she got into, where somebody wouldn't say, come crash on my couch, you know, you know, come share my bed, it's okay, you know, we'll take care of you. Okay, so, and for me, I'm a highly individualistic person, so I look at this and I can see the good and the bad. I know when I first moved here, our youngest son was 20, and a lot of Mexicans were kind of shocked that we would leave a 20-year-old behind to fend for himself and come here. Pretty much we all did that, right? We all left our families behind. And for a lot of people who live here, that was, whoa, one of my friends, her daughter moved from Ajijic to Chapala. It was, oh, she's so far away. What am I gonna do? So that was dimension 1. Okay, dimension 2 covers achievement, and the scale is competitive versus cooperative. So in a competitive culture, they believe the best results are achieved when each party advocates for themselves. In a cooperative one, they believe the best results are achieved when all parties try to achieve maximum harmony. So a clarification, this refers to how things get done, or how to get the best results for people, like in business or education. It doesn't refer to, competitive games, to sports and things like that. Because in all cultures, they want to win the World Cup. There's no ambiguity there. Okay, so the Anglo culture is rated competitive in the course. Business is considered separate from personal. When you could say to somebody, sorry to do this, but it's just business. It's just, the way things go. And the philosophy is, if all parties try to maximize their own gain, we'll achieve the best final solution. Whereas the Latin American is much more cooperative. Business is personal. You make relationships first, and then you do business. So the philosophy is, let's build a relationship and trust first, and then we'll work together to achieve the final solution. With the belief that that's how things are going to come out best, okay? So some examples of that, building business relationships before trying to negotiate a deal. I don't know if any of you here are involved in business, but you may find, you just want to go in and start talking business, and they're going, no, let's go to dinner. Let's get to know each other a little bit first. And then they're ready to talk business. Another big thing is using confrontation to get a problem rectified. So in the United States, we believe in assertiveness. We believe we advocate strongly for ourselves. If we're having a problem with a business, that's the best way to go. So I remember I had a problem with Telcel, and I went in to talk to them about it, and they were putting me off. And so I immediately went into, USA mode of, hey, you can't do this to me. And I could just see a shudder come down over the guy's face. He just completely tuned out, because confrontation is just not the way things get done here. I realized, I took a deep breath, I backed off, and approached it in a much more calm manner. And I still didn't get exactly what I wanted, but we were at least able to progress with the problem. You may notice, for instance, if you go into a store, you say hi to the service person before you tell them what you want. You say, buenos dias, ¿cómo está?, etc. And I don't know if this observation really belongs in this category, but I have seen, and this has influenced me a great deal, that Mexico has, in general, a very live and let live attitude. So the idea is, I'll put up with your crap if you put up with mine. With your neighbor's noise or whatever. Someday I'm going to have that loud party. And I was extremely impressed, when you're sitting in a restaurant and vendors come in, they don't make any attempt to chase them out. They can come in and they're selling you the bread and the vegetables and all of that. It may be uncomfortable for us, but I can, it's a compassion of these people need to make a living too. Abby, my Spanish tutor, plays flute, and she was playing near Black and White in the plaza, and somebody asked her, it was an expat who said, we're really trying to talk here. Can you go play somewhere else? And that was so amazing to her, that direct confrontation, that she ended up in tears. And I asked her, well, how could they have said it politely? She goes, what would a Mexican have said? And she said, we would have just listened. You know, they would have just put up with it. She'll be moving on. It's okay. So, okay, so that's competitive versus cooperative. The third dimension is power, low versus high power distance. So in a low power distance culture, the ideal is that everyone is equal. So employees, students, and children expect to be given a voice in things. Maybe not a fully equal voice, but a voice. In a high power distance culture, there are clearly defined levels of authority. So employees, students, and children expect to be given instructions. They expect you to tell them what to do, and they do it. Anglo culture was rated as moderate to low power distance, as being officially uncomfortable with hierarchy, that everybody is equal, right? And they consider it something to be minimized, hierarchy something to be minimized, at least in the official aspiration. In reality, a lot of people really like hierarchy. You know, we aren't at the Scandinavian level where kids in school call their teachers by their first names, for instance. But it's much lower power distance than in Latin America, where they're still very comfortable with hierarchy. I believe that's changing through the generations, but they consider it natural and inevitable. And you can see just in the use of tu versus usted, which we all struggle with, when we should use one or the other, tu being the informal you, and usted being the formal you, which of course we used to have in English, but it's mostly gone out of use. So I asked friends, you know, how old do you have to be before your parents or teachers are tu instead of usted? People maybe middle-aged and older say never. Your parents are always usted. But I noticed for those people, their kids call them tu. I don't know if you ever noticed in prayers that God is referred to as tu, which is true in English also, thou, the informal. I find that very fascinating. So I would have people on my street, my age or older, who never quit using usted with me, so I followed that pattern after years, and still call me Senora instead of by my name, while the kids are calling me Sandy. And I also noticed that some of the kids I knew as kids who have now become young adults have switched to tu with me, who used to use usted. Some experiences I've had with this, I worked in the Tepewa Community Center, helping to teach the sewing class, and it was really interesting being in charge of a program. So about half the students would never call me by my first name, and pressuring them to would just make them uncomfortable. I was Maestra. Okay, the other half, I was Sandy. And these are the ones who would tease me about my bad Spanish, etc. You know, they were the ones I really considered more friends. So an interesting experience I had was I was going to drive some of them. We were going to have a party. I was going to drive some of them to the party. So I go to the community center and pick them up. And I look the address up on my GPS, and it tells me where it is, and off we go. And very quickly, they started kind of mumbling between themselves in the back seat, kind of, you know, and they sounded kind of alarmed. I'm thinking, okay, keep driving. And finally, I said, okay, what are you guys talking about? This was all in Spanish, because one of the reasons that I couldn't understand them when they were mumbling. And it turned out that they let me drive 20 minutes in the wrong direction, because nobody wanted to tell La Maestra that she was going the wrong way. Now, I will take responsibility for that too, because I should have said, has anybody been there before? Instead of just relying on my GPS, because you know there's duplicate street names all over the place. And another time I was working in the kids program, and we were having a play time for the kids, and there was a barbell, and the weights kept falling off the ends, and these kids were playing with it, and there was a bunch of parents sitting right there. And I'm thinking, oh, that looks really dangerous. Why don't they say something? And finally, one of them said to me, don't you think you should stop them from doing that? Because once we had taken charge of the program, we were considered to be the ones who, you know, made the rules. And my friend Abby had a really interesting experience. She worked in a hostel in Guadalajara, where she worked at the reception desk, and she had a friend there she was on a tu basis with. And then the boss asked her to start teaching English. And she noticed that when she was giving an English class, that same person called her maestra and started calling her usted. So in the role of teacher, all of a sudden, it was a much more formal hierarchical relationship than when she was just a receptionist on the desk. Okay, so that was dimension 3. Dimension 4 has to do with rules, particularist or universalist. So universalist says that rules or laws apply to everyone equally. And a particularist says that rule or law interpretation and enforcement depends on the circumstances and who you are. Okay, so in a universalist culture, they believe in applying rules universally or fairly. And the legal system relies on an objective application of rule of law. Contracts must be strictly adhered to. In a particularist, the highest principle is taking care of your own. And the legal system has a lot of latitude to consider the circumstances of a case, and contracts are seen more as guidelines that can change over time. So the Anglo culture is highly universalist. Okay, we say justice is blind. We have the blindfold on our statue about justice. We say nobody is above the law. Of course, in practice, it doesn't always come out that way because we're human beings and we are going to tend to favor people we know or people who are like us. But theoretically, that's our highest principle is that fairness. Whereas Latin American cultures are moderately particularist. And a lot of that's because of family importance. Maybe more so in Mexico than some of the other Latin American countries. So for instance, here in the legal system and business, etc., your connections are extremely important. Everybody knows a guy, right? And if you use that guy, you're going to get a lot better results. A really interesting thing is the attitude toward nepotism here in the United States. So I worked for a very large private company, not privately owned company in the United States. Some of you may be familiar if you're from California with the Raley's grocery chain. Privately owned, and so they had nepotism like crazy in that company. The family worked there, and generally the results were that they didn't work very hard. They knew they weren't going to lose their job. The people who reported to them ended up having to pick up the slack. It was not a very good situation. So you tend to think of it as bad, and especially in government jobs and publicly owned companies, it's often illegal, right, to practice it. But in Latin American cultures, it's considered obvious. Who else are you going to hire? You're going to hire your family. Who else can you trust? And the whole, when you think about it, the whole family thing, the difference, comes a lot from the history of the two countries. So in Mexico, Spain came in, and they were the oppressors. They enslaved people. And so essentially, you had to hunker down and gather with people you could trust to protect yourself. And that would usually be your family. Who could you better trust than your family? And finally, the oppressors were thrown out, but the family values stayed. Whereas in the United States and Canada, it was immigrants came in that kind of held down or sometimes completely obliterated the indigenous people and took over. And so it was a big value to leave where you were from and go off somewhere else, leave your family behind, go off somewhere else, leave the East Coast behind and explore over to the West. So that became a value there. And so you can see that, with the nepotism, your family is the one you can trust. Of course you're going to hire them. Of course they're going to want to do the best for you. And so there are some jobs, I don't know how many of you are aware, and this is going away, but for instance, we have a friend whose father was employed by CFE, and he automatically went into the position when his dad retired. It was an inherited position. He didn't go into the same one his dad had. He was going to have to work his way, but it created an opening for him, and he automatically got the job, provided he could kind of prove that he could handle it. But and that used to be way more common. Something I looked up said that in Mexico, 88 families have held control over 455 federal legislative positions during the last 81 years. So it's just accepted that that's what you're going to do. Like I said, I'm not making a judgment one way or the other. I can see both sides of the story. Abby gave me an example from, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the TV series Better Call Saul. There's two brothers. One's a good guy who is very ethical, and one's very shady. And the shady guy wants his brother to sign something for him because he still has good reputation. And the brother won't do it because he suspects he's going to do something shady, right? And Abby said, that struck her as really weird. You would sign for your brother. It's your brother. It doesn't really matter what he's going to do. The brother principle is higher. Okay, so I thought that was really interesting. Your obligation to your friends and family comes first. Okay, fifth dimension is time. So we've all, even Mexicans talk about Mexican time. So we're all familiar with some of the differences there. The scale is punctuality versus relationships, interestingly. So punctuality-oriented appointments and deadlines have priority, and a relationship-oriented family and friends have priority. And it's a difference between clock time and event time. So clock time assumes that an individual has a lot of control over what happens, and that events are subject to a predetermined schedule. You can kind of force events into a schedule. Whereas relationship-oriented assumes that stuff happens that might affect a schedule, that you're going to kind of roll with it, and that events unfold on their own time. Like, you can't take 9 women and have a baby in a month. It has to happen on its own time. So USA and Canada are obviously strongly oriented toward punctuality and clock time, and that may have been brought in by the Industrial Revolution, which Mexico also had, but not as much of the, the leaving the small villages and stuff. Mexico is strongly oriented toward relationships and event time. And when you think about it, in the history of humanity, it's only been in the last maybe 150 years that clock time has become so important. In the history of humanity, it was always event time. So some examples. So talking to Abby about this again, I was asking her under what circumstances punctuality is important. And she had an interesting hierarchy. She said that jobs was number 1. If you work for something like Walmart, you have to touch a clock. You have to be there on time. You'll be there on time. Next level down was school. That would depend on what your professor wanted, or it would usually start in secondary or prepa. That they would tell you what their expectation was for how late you could be, and sometimes they were late, and sometimes they didn't show up. Then the next one was, I believe, was friends. Leaving friends in the lurch, or like if your friend's hanging out at home, you might be an hour late because, hey, they're at home, and what difference does it make? The big one for me was the start time of a party or event, and some of you may have encountered this. So when we first got here, we were invited to a party. They said it would start about 8. We thought, oh, no, it's not going to start at 8. We'll try like 8:30. So we went over it was on our street. We went over to the house at 8:30, and the host is still in his apron cutting vegetables, and it's obvious nobody's there. So we just said, okay, come get us when you're really ready. And they sent the kids over at about 9:30. We got there was about 3 people there, and it really started at about 10:30. And then it goes on and on and on. Well, we've kind of gotten used to that. So now I have a hard time with an expat party when they say it starts at 6. You're there at 6, and you're ready to go home by about 8:30 usually. And so they push all the good stuff. If they're going to have music or whatever, that's going to be up at the front, so nobody misses it. So nobody goes home before it happens. Whereas in a Mexican party, that's going to be 2 or 3 hours in. And if you get there too early, you may get tired before it shows up. So, an interesting experience I had with this was I was helping a bunch of teenage girls. One was about to have her quince party, her 15-year-old, and they wanted to do a dance. So I was helping them learn this dance from some videos online. And they were just showing up late, not showing up at all. I was waiting around for them, and I'm trying to think of what to do. And I realized just telling them, you got to be here on time, was never going to work. So I said, well, here's the deal, okay? Well, I have this hour from 3 to 4. Whenever you arrive, we end at 4. If you get here at 3:45, we still end at 4. If by 3:15 you aren't here and I have other things to do, I'll probably leave. And they were just fine with that. And there were probably times they showed up at my door and I wasn't there. I was like, oh, okay, I guess we're not having it today, and off they go. So I had to get a lot more mellow about that. And in USA we do that, we are more explicit. We use things like time windows between 3 and 6, or, ish, 10-ish, to let people know that it's not, absolutely necessary. So Abby shared with me this sign that she saw on a small business. And you know how the small businesses close during siesta time? So that is very much an event time sort of thing, that you need time to rest. And it probably is, it gets so hot in the afternoon, it probably came from that, but you rest, spend some time with your family, and then come and open the store back up. And sometimes, you decide not to open the store back up or not to open the store that day. So she saw a sign that I thought was really cute. It said, abrimos cuando llegamos, cerramos cuando nos vamos, y si no está abierto, no estamos. Okay, so we open when we arrive, we close when we leave, and if it's not open, we aren't here. Okay, so communication, the next one, direct versus indirect communication. So direct communication, the message is explicit and being clear and concise is valued. The speaker is responsible for communicating clearly and words are more important than context. In indirect communication, much of the message is implicit, for instance, softening refusals and criticisms. The receiver is responsible for interpreting correctly, and context is more important than words. Okay, so context is everything surrounding the communication. So it's your body language, facial, what's happening around you at the time, the relationship between the communicators, etc. And it really only works well in small towns like this one where people know each other pretty well. Anglo cultures tend to be very direct with low context, and Latin American are indirect with high context. And for people from high context cultures, low context communication may seem blunt or even rude. Okay, but from people from low context cultures who expect that direct communication, high context communication is frequently misunderstood or may even seem evasive. You don't get what the message is. It doesn't mean that either of them is good or bad, once again. It's just a different style, and you have to be aware when it's frustrating you that they're not trying to frustrate you. So some examples you may have encountered here about, you aren't supposed to say no outright. Saying no outright is considered pretty rude. And so you have a lot of other ways of saying that. For instance, if a vendor is trying to sell to you, you might say luego or mañana or something like that, or you might just say gracias, which is very confusing to a lot of us, but I just told them no by saying gracias, especially if you get a little shake of the head or something. But that's the context, they understand that. Another thing I found really interesting here that's context oriented is giving directions, and this probably doesn't happen in the big city, but here, I know Mexicans who've lived here all their lives, and I'll say something like, well, you go to Galeana, and then, you go down to the SECs and turn left, and they're looking at me like, I do not know the street names. You have to say, well, go to the street the church is on, the street that runs behind the church, and, so you use landmarks, and that's what they're used to navigating by. They pay no attention to the street names. And that's, that's context. That's kind of abstract versus concrete. And in the Anglo cultures, we have our ways of using euphemisms to do a refusal. If you remember, probably all of us here remember, I have to wash my hair. When washing your hair actually took the whole evening because you had to put it in curlers and sit under the dryer or whatever. But the guy was really supposed to know it meant, I really don't want to go out with you. Okay, because it's such a lame excuse. Abby shared with me experiences when she worked in a call center where she talked with Mexicans and English speakers from the United States and Canada, and she was trying to sell a product, and she said for the Spanish speakers she would use a lot of upfront. This is how great it is. It's a great deal. This is what you're going to get. Blah blah blah. Before she went into the price, and the English speakers would say, okay, get to the point. So they didn't want to hear all that stuff up front. They just wanted her to tell them, what's it going to cost me? And she found that kind of overly direct. But once again, they weren't trying to be rude in either direction. Okay, so that was dimension 6. Dimension 7 is expressiveness, neutral versus affective. So neutral is emotionally reserved. They don't reveal what they're thinking or feeling. Cool and self-possessed conduct is admired. Physical contacts, gesturing, or strong facial expressions are often taboo, and they tend to be more reserved. Affective is emotionally expressive. They reveal thoughts and feelings verbally and non-verbally. Animated expression is admired, while laughing, very animated conversations. Touching, gesturing, and strong facial expressions are common, and they're gregarious. So So Latin America is considered highly affective, and they consider themselves that way too. You know, that they're warm, they're more tactile, they have less personal space and more eye contact, which is one of those unconscious things that you may feel like, oh, you know, getting too pushy, but it's just an unconscious cultural thing. Whereas the Anglos are moderately neutral. So I know that many Europeans consider Americans like overly friendly, almost puppy doggish, you know, in their enthusiasm. Especially Eastern Europeans, you know, it's all the legends about the Russians that they, you know, they never smile. And when you smile at them, they think, what's their, you know, what are they trying to get out of me, or what are they hiding? Yeah, so it can cause, this can cause a lot of problems. People from cultures that are more neutral can see people from affective cultures as overdramatic or impulsive. They're not, it's just a cultural thing. People from cultures that are more affective can see people from neutral cultures as unfeeling, disinterested, or snobbish. Once again, they're not, it's just a cultural thing. They all consider themselves to be acting in an appropriate way, not trying to be rude. Okay, so I have learned to be, I'm pretty reserved. I've learned to be much more demonstrative since coming here. But I'm probably still considered kind of standoffish relative to the culture. But I do, you know, I do try when I'm walking down the street, lots of smiling and saying hello and stuff like that, which is also a small town thing. Abby verified that, you know, in Guadalajara, people kind of going, you know, what are you up to? But, so I think that's an important thing to remember. It's just that everybody is trying to act in an appropriate way. Okay, dimension 8 is social norms. Tight versus loose. So tight societies are formal and disciplined. They have clearly stated social norms, and they rebuke individuals who stray from the norm. Whereas loose societies are informal, they have weak or ambiguous norms, and they tolerate deviant behavior. So in the course, Mexico was rated at 7.2 on the scale towards being tight, and the United States was right in the middle at 5.1. Okay, so the United States is not considered a loose culture, and I know, once again, a lot of Europeans consider U.S. people to be fairly prudish. So looking at, you know, my experience with Mexico on how tight they really are, I found it to be very complicated. And it's changing fast, too. So for instance, I have a friend who visited maybe 40 years ago with her teenage daughters. Hot day, they wanted to wear shorts, and they weren't allowed on the metro because they were in shorts, okay? Whereas now, you know, that wouldn't be any problem at all. You know, you look at the videos, and everybody's in their sexy outfits, dancing, and etc. But the really interesting thing is there's a photographer that photographs mass crowds of people in the nude. I can't remember what his name is. And the biggest crowd he ever got was Mexico City, 18,000 people. In the Zocalo, all took their clothes off and got photographed, okay? And I find actually that talking about the body and body functions, people are much more relaxed. Mexicans are much more relaxed, for me, than most Americans that I talk to. I find that very interesting. It's just considered natural. I have friends who a generation ago were not actually allowed to talk to boys unchaperoned, whereas lately I've been to a quinceañera where there were 12-year-olds getting beer, and then all the teenagers would go up to the loft above, and who knows what they were doing up there. And that, you know, you think about the Roman Catholic influence on Mexico, which is very strong, but they also have a very strong separation of church and state. I don't know how many of you are aware that to get married legally, you have to go to a civil office to do it. Clergy, it does not have the capacity to give you a legal marriage. And you don't have to have a church marriage. You can just go to the civil office. So for that reason, some of the bigger cities were able to have, you know, gay marriage much sooner because it was just a civil, you know, a legal thing. Okay, so the separation is pretty strong. The other thing is the tradition of the double meaning, the doble sentido, which is a very popular game that especially men play. It's kind of like in English we say that's what she said, that's what he said, and you make a double, you know, like a naughty meaning out of everything that's said. That's a very popular game here, and it's, you know, it's played extensively. to great hilarity. So that's another example of, well, you know, it's certainly not, from the original impression I got, was certainly not borne out. Okay, so the next one is risk, low versus high certainty avoidance. This is dimension 9. Low uncertainty avoidance is accepting of risk. They take reasonable precautions and make a reasonable effort to get things done, to accomplish their plan. But what happens, happens. High uncertainty avoidance is risk averse, and they try to control things so problems can be avoided. So they have a lot of rules, planning, tracking, schedules, and deadlines. Now, where would you put the cultures on that? Okay? In the course, they said the Anglo had low uncertainty avoidance, they were accepting a risk, and that the Latin American had high, that they were risk averse. And I find it to be just the opposite. Okay? So you may find, like in Latin America, they're much more tied up in the tradition and the hierarchy and stuff like that. That's not risk, that's just attachment to your roots. So I was a software developer in the U.S., and they were always trying to get us to, plan a project 2 years out and tell them what would happen. We had no idea what would happen. We hadn't even got into it yet. And then they wanted us to track to the, and why isn't it done on time? There's a new development, it's not that new anymore, a philosophy called agile development, which says, in your project, take the most important thing, strip it out, do it, deliver it, and see how it's going before you move on to the next thing. Because you just can't, stick with the schedule. So I consider the U.S. to be extremely risk averse. The laws and everything against, the warnings on packages, et cetera, et cetera. I know it's, because of the lawsuit culture, but, whereas here, you watch them build something. Watch them remodel a house. I have never seen anybody consult a blueprint. I have rarely seen them use a tape measure, but these things turn out beautiful, don't they? They just, you're stunned afterwards at how nice it turned out. All the corners are beautifully square and everything. So there's just a general impression that everything is going to turn out fine in the end. And this has been the biggest influence on me, because I'm a person who tends to fret over the details and worry about things going wrong. More people are going to show up, we're not going to have enough food, we're going to have too much food, we're going to waste it, blah, 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 And I've had to really watch how it goes and see how much better it is to not have that attitude. If I have a friend who went to a wedding where, the bride turned up a half hour late, everything went wrong, could possibly go wrong. Hey, the people got married and they were happy. And they were perfectly happy with their wedding. And going back to the dance with the quinceañera, we worked on it. I had no idea how it was going to turn out. As it turned out, the girls did a great job. They delivered the dance beautifully, but it wouldn't have mattered. Their friends would have cheered just as loud and enjoyed it just as much no matter what happened. And the other thing here is, if you ask somebody, can you build me this? Can you fix that? Yeah. They'll figure out a way, And that's so different experience. I say, no, we can't do that. That's against regulations. It's something. Very entrepreneurial, improvisational here. I think the most entrepreneurial culture I've ever seen. Okay, so that's uncertainty avoidance. And I'm on dimension 10 now, which is lifestyle. And the scale here is being versus doing. So a being culture, they work to live. The job has a limited role in identity, and the personal demands and quality of life take priority. In a doing culture, they live to work. The job has a big role in a person's identity. Job demands take priority. And sometimes they have a hard time doing nothing. Okay, so Anglo is an extreme doing culture. And yes, I have a hard time doing nothing. Something I'm working on. But Latin America is an extreme being culture. I don't know how many of you have heard the story of the Mexican fisherman. It's a popular story that's told often. Fisherman on a lake, New York businessman is observing him and observes he only works about half a day. And in half a day, he's able to catch enough fish to feed his family and to sell some extra so he can get some of the other things he needs. And then he goes off and he plays with his kids and he hangs out with his friends and has a beer. He plays his guitar, etc. So the businessman, thinking to help him out, starts trying to motivate him to achieve more. work longer hours, well, then you can hire people, and then you can sell to more people, and eventually you could open a factory, and you can can this stuff, and you can send it all over. And the Mexicans kind of going, okay, and then what, and then what? And finally, the businessman says, now we get to the best part. When you're 65, you can retire, and you can live by a lake, and go fishing, and play with your grandkids, and have a beer with your friends, and play your guitar. Okay, so exactly obviously what he was doing now, except that the other guy thought, well, no, you have to earn it first. Okay, so you know that, one of the first questions that people ask you in Anglo cultures is, what do you do? If you're asked that here, it might be more, what are your hobbies? What are your pastimes? What are the things that interest you or you find beautiful? I think that a lot of the doing culture is trickling out. The impact of materialism, the impact of social media, everything. I think that's kind of a shame. Two of the things that illustrate this best that I like, two of my favorite things about Mexico are siestas and fiestas. So I feel like the siestas, we get back to that old clock time, right? They're paying attention to biorhythms. They're paying attention to the environment. It's hot, Everybody is kind of feeling, they're in their post-lunch slump. Why are we trying to get work done? Let's just honor that, and then we'll get back to it later. And with fiestas, enjoying times with friends and family is a priority. A fiesta is a big deal here. It's what you do for fun. You go and you hang out with your friends, and you settle in, you stay. That type of thing. So this has been another big impact on me of really trying to, about to wrap it up, just about really trying to absorb more of the lessons of the being culture and the event time and all of that. Okay, so wrapping it up. So what I'm encouraging you to do is recognize the unconscious level of your cultural differences. Recognize that each culture's values exist because they contributed to the survival of that group at some point. Try to understand the foreign cultures rather than just bumping your head against it. And let yourself learn from it. Let it expand your mind and broaden your perspective. Here's a Mark Twain quote. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. Okay, so my advice, let Mexico mellow you out. You can't change it, but it can change you. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. That was excellent. We do have time for just a couple of questions. And obviously I've got a problem walking to you with the microphone, so if you can shout it out, and if you can repeat the question, that'd be great.
Sandy, an observation and a question. This same thing is in the United States. I grew up in the deep South, and you cannot imagine a culture shock of going to New York. It's in your face. We don't do that. But my question is, I hear from so many Americans that are here of the contractor that they had to give half the money and he never showed up. Is he going to show up, or is that something else?
Well, so he's asking, he's heard stories about the contractor, you give half the money and they never show up. Are they eventually going to show up? Maybe. This is where knowing a guy is important. You take advantage of your connections, you get recommendations. You make sure you really know what's going to happen.
Maybe they didn't have that relationship established?
It's possible, but there's good and bad people in every culture. There's people who take advantage in every culture.
For you first, because I think yours is going to be shorter than I know.
He knows me.
One of the things that may have been covered in this topic is transactions. Many years ago, before I ever came to Mexico, a friend told me this story.
Unfortunately, we can't hear the story, and she won't be able to remember to repeat it. Be brief, though. We're running a little over, so...
We want to tell us about the transaction.
So a friend told me this story many years ago before I ever came to Mexico. He said he was in a small town in Mexico, and he went to some kind of a market. There was a man squatting on the ground. In front of him there was a blanket. And on the blanket there was some tchotchkes of some sort in which my friend really didn't have any interest. And he started haggling with the Mexican vendor about this. And after a while, the Mexican vendor looked up at him and said, "Senor, for you, this is just a game. For me, it's a living."
Okay. I would like to give you my impression on usted. I was raised Mexican. I went to the United States. I'm 20. I lived half my life there. So usted, it goes according to the confidence on the relationship you have with the person. If you don't know the person, yes, you have to address usted. Later on, you become very good friends. Then you don't have to use it. And we were raised to respect our elders. And there is another higher level that is no longer used. Rich people, we used to call them don and doña. It's no longer used. Okay? Also, Mexicans, they're adjust to any situation. My partner and I went to visit my daughter in Saltillo. Okay? Suddenly, the relatives of her husband came. The house was full. The American culture, you have to arrange where everybody's going to sleep, how many food, and all of that. And there, everybody adjusted. At night, they sleep on sofa, on the floor, everything. And the ladies pitching in the kitchen. For gathering, family ties are more important than comforters.
Thank you, Anna.